My name is Rebecca and I'm 32 years old. If you've ever been told by someone who hurt you that you'd never find happiness again, if you've ever had to face the person who broke your heart while they celebrated their new life, if you've ever discovered that the universe has a sense of humor and perfect timing, hit that like button and subscribe because this story is about to show you that sometimes karma doesn't just catch up, it arrives in the most spectacular way possible. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in late September, one of those perfect early fall days in Charleston, South Carolina when the oppressive summer humidity finally breaks and you can breathe again without feeling like you're inhaling soup. I was living in a renovated carriage house in the historic district, one of those narrow, charming buildings with exposed brick walls and original heart pine floors that creaked with every step. My mailbox was one of those old brass ones mounted next to a bright blue door, and I'd developed a habit of checking it on my way home from work, usually finding nothing but catalogs and bills. But that day, there was a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written in elaborate calligraphy. Before I even opened it, I knew what it was. The return address was from Kiowa Island, one of those exclusive barrier island communities where Charleston's wealthy families had vacation homes and country clubs. I stood there on the cobblestone sidewalk, tourists passing by with their cameras and their maps of the historic homes, and I opened the envelope with hands that were suddenly shaking. Daniel Carter and Mackenzie Whitmore request the honor of your presence at their wedding. The words swam in front of my eyes. Daniel. My ex-fiancé. The man I'd been with for 5 years. The man I'd planned a life with. The man who'd broken up with me 2 years ago via a carefully worded text message while I was visiting my sick grandmother in Savannah. He was getting married and for some godforsaken reason he'd decided to invite me. I walked up the stairs to my apartment in a daze, dropping my work bag on the vintage velvet sofa I'd found at an estate sale, and just stared at the invitation. The wedding was in 6 weeks at St. Philip's Church, one of the most beautiful and prestigious churches in Charleston, followed by a reception at the Kiowa Island Golf Resort. Of course it was. Daniel's family had money, old Charleston money that came with historic homes and country club memberships and social expectations that I'd never quite managed to meet. We'd met when I was 25, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in historic preservation, working for the Charleston Historical Society and barely making enough to afford my tiny studio apartment. Daniel was a junior partner at his father's law firm, driving a BMW and living in a condo overlooking the harbor. We'd been introduced at a gallery opening by a mutual friend, and he'd been charming and attentive and interested in my work in a way that felt genuine. For the first few years it was good. He took me to nice restaurants and introduced me to his friends and seemed proud of what I did, even if his family made it clear they'd prefer if I did something more lucrative or at least more socially prestigious. His mother, Patricia Carter, was everything you'd expect from a Charleston society matron. Perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly rent, an endless wardrobe of Lilly Pulitzer and tasteful pearls, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. Patricia made her feelings about me clear in 1,000 small ways. Comments about how interesting it was that I worked such demanding hours for such little pay. Observations about how the other wives in their social circle didn't work at all, or if they did, it was part-time at their families' businesses or charity organizations. Questions about my family that were really attempts to figure out our social standing, our net worth, whether we had the right kind of connections. My parents were solidly middle class, my dad a high school teacher and my mom a nurse, and in Patricia's world that might as well have been poverty. But Daniel always defended me, or at least I thought he did. He'd tell his mother I was brilliant and passionate about my work, that he admired my dedication to preserving Charleston's architectural heritage. He'd hold my hand at family dinners when his mother made her pointed comments. He'd tell me later that she just needed time to get to know me, that she'd come around eventually. After 3 years together, Daniel proposed. It was during the Spoleto Festival, at intermission of an outdoor performance in one of the historic garden courtyards. He got down on one knee right there among the camellias and azaleas, with string lights overhead and other audience members watching and applauding. The ring was beautiful, a vintage setting with a diamond that caught the light like captured stars. I said yes because I loved him, because I'd built a life with him, because I believed we were building a future together. The engagement lasted 2 years, and it was during those 2 years that everything slowly unraveled. Wedding planning became a minefield. Patricia wanted to plan everything, wanted a massive society wedding at the country club with 400 guests I'd never met. I wanted something smaller and more intimate, maybe at one of the historic homes I'd helped restore with just family and close friends. Every conversation became a negotiation, and Daniel increasingly sided with his mother, telling me it was easier to just let her have what she wanted, that this wedding was important for his family's social standing. I started noticing other things too. How Daniel would change the subject when I talked about my work with his colleagues. How he'd suggest I wear different clothes to his family events, things more in line with what the other women wore. How he'd started talking about me eventually taking a less demanding job, maybe something part-time so I could focus on our future family and social obligations. The man who'd seemed proud of my career was slowly trying to reshape me into someone who fit better into his world. The breaking point came during a visit to my grandmother in Savannah. She'd had a stroke and was in the hospital, and I'd driven up to be with her and my parents. I'd been there for 3 days, sitting by her bedside helping my parents navigate medical decisions, trying to hold my family together during a scary time. Daniel had stayed in Charleston, saying he couldn't take time off work, which I understood even though it hurt that he couldn't be there to support me. On the 3rd night, exhausted and emotionally drained after a long day at the hospital, I got a text message from Daniel. Not a call, a text. It was long and carefully worded, the kind of message someone writes and rewrites multiple times. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he loved me but wasn't sure we wanted the same things. He said his family had concerns about our compatibility. He said maybe it was better to face this now rather than after we were married. He said he thought we should end our engagement and go our separate ways. I read that message sitting in the parking lot of Savannah Memorial Hospital, the Georgia humidity pressing down like a weight, the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks looking suddenly sinister instead of romantic. He'd broken up with me via text while my grandmother was possibly dying. He'd ended 5 years together, including a 2-year engagement, without even having the courage to do it in person or over the phone. I called him immediately, my hands shaking with rage and hurt and disbelief. He answered but sounded distant, apologetic but firm. He said he was sorry about the timing but he'd made his decision. When I asked if this was about his mother, if Patricia had finally convinced him I wasn't good enough, he didn't deny it. He just said his family was important to him and he needed to be with someone who fit better into his world, someone who understood the social obligations and expectations that came with his position. I asked if there was someone else. There was a pause, too long, too telling. He said no, but I didn't believe him. Later, through mutual friends, I learned that he'd been seeing Mackenzie for a few months before he broke up with me. Mackenzie Whitmore, whose family was even wealthier than the Carters, whose mother was on all the same charity boards as Patricia, who'd gone to the right schools and belonged to the right clubs and would fit seamlessly into Daniel's world in all the ways I never could. The months after the breakup were some of the darkest of my life. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects at the Historical Society, volunteering for evening and weekend events, anything to avoid sitting alone in my apartment thinking about the life I'd planned that had evaporated. My friends rallied around me, taking me out for drinks and dinners, letting me cry and rage and slowly process the grief of losing not just a relationship but an entire imagined future. Charleston is a small city despite its tourism and growth, and I couldn't avoid seeing Daniel occasionally. We moved in overlapping social circles, attended some of the same professional events, had mutual friends who tried awkwardly to maintain relationships with both of us. I'd see him across a room and feel my chest tighten, would watch him laugh with his new girlfriend and wonder what was wrong with me that I hadn't been enough. About 6 months after the breakup, I went to a historic preservation conference in Asheville. I almost didn't go, feeling too raw and exhausted to network and socialize. But my boss insisted, saying I needed to get out of Charleston for a bit, needed to remember there was a whole world beyond my heartbreak. So I drove up into the North Carolina mountains, checked into the conference hotel, and resigned myself to 3 days of presentations and awkward small talk. That's where I met Thomas. Father Thomas Mitchell, to be specific, though he insisted everyone just call him Thomas or Tom. He was a Catholic priest, 35 years old, with kind eyes and an easy smile and a genuine passion for historic church architecture. He was attending the conference because his parish, a beautiful old church in Columbia, South Carolina, was undergoing restoration, and he wanted to better understand the process and the importance of preserving original features. We ended up sitting next to each other at a presentation about 19th century ecclesiastical architecture, and afterward he asked if I wanted to grab coffee and discuss some of the concepts that had been presented. We sat in the hotel cafe for 3 hours, talking about Gothic revival details and the challenge of modernizing historic buildings while maintaining their integrity. He was intelligent and thoughtful and had a way of listening that made you feel truly heard. Over the next few days of the conference, we kept running into each other, or maybe we were seeking each other out, I wasn't entirely sure. We attended presentations together, grabbed meals, explored Asheville's historic downtown in the evenings. He told me about his path to priesthood, how he'd felt called to service and found deep meaning in his vocation. I told him about my work, about growing up in Charleston, about my love for the city's architecture and history. I didn't tell him about Daniel, about the broken engagement, about feeling like I'd failed at the one relationship that was supposed to last forever. On the last night of the conference, we had dinner at a small restaurant in downtown Asheville, and Thomas told me something that surprised me. He said he hadn't always been a priest, that he'd been engaged once in his 20s before he entered seminary. The relationship had ended badly, his fiancé leaving him for someone else, and he'd spent years struggling with feelings of rejection and inadequacy. His path to priesthood had been partly spiritual calling and partly healing journey, finding purpose and peace through service to others. I found myself telling him everything then, the whole story of Daniel and the breakup and the text message, and how I still felt broken and insufficient. Thomas listened without judgment, without trying to fix it or offer platitudes. When I finished, he said something I've never forgotten. He said that sometimes people leave our lives not because we're inadequate, but because we're meant for different paths, and holding on to the wrong relationship would prevent us from finding the right one. He said that the pain of rejection often has more to do with the person doing the rejecting than the person being rejected. We exchanged contact information before leaving Asheville, promising to stay in touch about the church restoration project and any future preservation conferences. I drove back to Charleston feeling lighter than I had in months, not fixed or healed exactly, but hopeful in a way I hadn't been since the breakup. Thomas and I did stay in touch. We emailed about architecture and restoration projects, shared articles and research we thought the other would find interesting. Occasionally, we'd meet for lunch when he was in Charleston for diocesan meetings, conversations that ranged from work to books to philosophy to our views on faith and meaning. He became a genuine friend, someone I could talk to about anything, someone who knew my story and liked me anyway. About a year after we met, Thomas's church restoration was complete, and he invited me to the rededication ceremony. I drove to Columbia on a Sunday morning, sat in the restored sanctuary with its original stained glass windows that we'd helped preserve, its refinished wooden pews, its carefully restored altar. The space was beautiful, filled with light and history and the prayers of generations. Thomas gave a homily about renewal and restoration, about how beautiful things can become even more beautiful through the process of careful, loving repair. After the ceremony, he introduced me to his parishioners, thanked me publicly for my consultation on the restoration project. An elderly woman told me the church looked just like she remembered from her childhood, that seeing it restored had brought her to tears. A young family thanked me for helping preserve a place where their children could be baptized and confirmed, where their family's spiritual life could continue. I felt that deep satisfaction that comes from doing work that matters, that lasts, that serves something bigger than yourself. Thomas walked me to my car afterward, and we stood in the church parking lot talking for almost an hour. He told me he was proud of me, that I'd rebuilt my life after heartbreak, that I was doing meaningful work, and seemed genuinely happy. I realized he was right. Somewhere in the past year, without fully noticing, I'd stopped defining myself by Daniel's rejection. I'd stopped feeling broken and started feeling whole again. That's when Daniel's wedding invitation arrived, dropping into my mailbox like a bomb into my newly peaceful life. I stared at it for days, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to throw it away and ignore it, to not give Daniel or his mother the satisfaction of seeing me at their society wedding. But another part of me, the stubborn part that had survived a breakup by text and rebuilt a life, wanted to go. Wanted to show up looking happy and successful, wanted to prove that I'd moved on, that his rejection hadn't destroyed me. I called Thomas, needing advice from someone who understood both the spiritual and practical aspects of this situation. He listened to my rambling explanation of who Daniel was, what had happened, why I was conflicted about this invitation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then asked me why I really wanted to go. Was it for closure? Was it to prove something? Was it because I still had feelings for Daniel? I thought about it honestly and realized it was none of those things. I wanted to go because I was genuinely okay now, genuinely happy with my life, and I wanted to prove to myself that seeing Daniel get married wouldn't break me. Thomas said that seemed like a healthy reason, but he cautioned me to be prepared for it to be harder than I expected, that seeing an ex with their new partner often stirred up complicated emotions even when you were truly over them. Then he said something unexpected. He said if I wanted company, someone to provide moral support and help me leave early if it became too much, he'd be happy to accompany me. I started to protest, saying I couldn't ask a priest to attend my ex's wedding as my emotional support person. But Thomas laughed and said priests went to all kinds of weddings, that he'd actually been invited to this one too. I was confused until he explained. St. Philip's Church, where the wedding was taking place, was Episcopal, not Catholic, but there was some kind of interfaith friendship between the churches, and Father Thomas had been invited to participate in the ceremony in a minor capacity. He said he'd assumed it was going to be just another wedding where he stood in the background representing ecumenical cooperation. He hadn't realized it was my ex's wedding until I told him the names. We decided to go together not as a date exactly, but as friends supporting each other through what would probably be an awkward event. I bought a new dress for the occasion, something elegant and sophisticated in deep emerald green that made me feel confident. The morning of the wedding, I met Thomas at a cafe downtown, and we drove together to St. Philip's Church. The church was stunning as I knew it would be. Built in the 1830s, it was a masterpiece of Greek Revival architecture with massive white columns and a soaring steeple that dominated the Charleston skyline. Inside, the sanctuary was filled with flowers, hundreds of white roses and hydrangeas, and every pew was packed with Charleston's social elite. I recognized many faces, people I'd met during my time with Daniel, people who'd smiled at me at parties and then disappeared from my life after the breakup. Thomas had to go prepare for his small ceremonial role, so I found a seat near the back trying to be unobtrusive. That's when Patricia Carter spotted me. Daniel's mother was holding court near the front of the church, resplendent in mother-of-the-bride style elegance, her silver hair perfectly styled, her dress clearly custom and expensive. When she saw me, her expression flickered with surprise and then something that looked almost like displeasure. She made her way down the aisle toward me, her smile fixed and cold. She leaned down as if to greet me warmly, but her words were anything but. She whispered that she was surprised I'd come, that it took a certain kind of person to attend their ex's wedding, that she hoped I wasn't here to cause any drama. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said Daniel had found his perfect match in Mackenzie, someone who truly understood what it meant to be part of their world, and that I should accept that some people were meant for happiness and others weren't. Before I could respond, she straightened up and moved on, leaving me sitting there with her poisonous words ringing in my ears. Some people were meant for happiness and others weren't. As if happiness was something predetermined, something allocated by social class or family connections, something I'd never be worthy of because I didn't come from old Charleston money. The ceremony began, and I watched Daniel walk down the aisle looking handsome and nervous. I watched Mackenzie float down in a dress that probably cost more than a year of my salary, looking like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. I watched them exchange vows and rings, watched their families beam with approval, watched Charleston society celebrate a union that made perfect sense in their world. And I felt nothing. No heartbreak, no longing, no regret. Just a distant sense of relief that I wasn't the one marrying Daniel, that I wasn't signing up for a lifetime of trying to fit into a world that would never fully accept me, that would always see me as less than because I chose meaningful work over social climbing. The priest, the Episcopal priest, not Thomas, was going through the standard ceremony when something unexpected happened. He paused after the exchange of vows and said that they had a special blessing to be offered by a visiting clergy member. He called Father Thomas Mitchell forward to offer an interfaith blessing over the marriage. I watched Thomas step forward, wearing his clerical collar and carrying himself with quiet dignity. He stood before Daniel and Mackenzie and began speaking about marriage as a sacred commitment, about the importance of mutual respect and shared values, about building a life together on a foundation of genuine love rather than social expectation or family pressure. His words were beautiful and appropriate, but there was something in his delivery, some subtle emphasis on certain phrases, that made me wonder if he was sending a message. When he talked about respecting each partner's individual calling and supporting their work in the world, I saw Daniel shift uncomfortably. When he mentioned the importance of standing by each other even when families or social circles had different expectations, I saw Patricia's smile tighten. Then Thomas did something that made the entire church hold its breath. He said that before offering the final blessing, he wanted to acknowledge someone present who'd taught him valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and finding joy even after disappointment. He looked directly at me, meeting my eyes across the crowded church, and said my full name. He said that Rebecca had shown him what it meant to rebuild after heartbreak, to find meaning in work that served others, to choose authenticity over acceptance. He said she'd consulted on the restoration of his church and in the process had helped restore his faith in human goodness and perseverance. He said he was grateful for her friendship, for her wisdom, for her example of grace under pressure. The church was absolutely silent. Every head had turned to look at me. Daniel's face had gone white. Patricia looked like she might actually faint. Mackenzie was gripping her bouquet so tightly I thought she might crush it. And I sat there, stunned, not sure whether to be mortified or grateful for this completely unexpected public acknowledgement. Then Thomas smiled, that warm, genuine smile I'd come to know so well, and delivered the final blow. He said he had one more announcement to make before offering the blessing. He said that after much prayer and discernment, he'd received permission from his bishop to leave active ministry. He was leaving the priesthood not because he'd lost his faith, but because he'd discovered a different calling. He'd fallen in love, he said, with a remarkable woman who'd shown him that service to others could take many forms, that sometimes the most sacred commitment was the one you made to a single person, to building a life together based on shared values and mutual respect. He said he'd been waiting for the right moment to make this announcement public, and it seemed appropriate to do it here, at a wedding celebrating commitment and new beginnings. And then, while the entire church watched in stunned silence, he walked down the aisle toward me, extended his hand and asked if I would join him. I stood up in a daze, took his hand and let him lead me out of the sanctuary. Behind us, I could hear the explosion of whispered conversation, gasps of shock, Patricia's outraged voice demanding to know what was happening. But Thomas and I kept walking out of the church into the Charleston sunshine, down the historic streets toward his car. We didn't stop until we were blocks away. And then Thomas started laughing, this joyful, liberated sound that I'd never heard from him before. I demanded to know what had just happened, whether he was serious, whether he'd really left the priesthood, whether he'd meant what he said about falling in love. He turned to me, took both my hands and said he'd never been more serious about anything in his life. He explained that he'd been going through discernment for months, long before he knew about Daniel's wedding. He'd realized that his calling was changing, that he felt pulled toward a different kind of service, one that included the possibility of marriage and family. He'd been granted a dispensation from his vows, had officially been released from active ministry the week before. He'd been planning to tell me but was waiting for the right moment. When I told him about the wedding invitation, about Patricia's cruel comments over the years, about my conflicted feelings about attending, he'd seen an opportunity. He'd contacted the Episcopal priest at St. Philip's and asked if he could offer a blessing at the ceremony, using his existing interfaith invitation as justification. He'd planned his words carefully, knowing they'd send a message to everyone in that church about true values and authentic commitment. And the part about being in love with me? That was completely true, he said. He'd fallen for me gradually over the past year and a half, had tried to fight it because of his vocation, had prayed and struggled and finally accepted that sometimes love finds you in unexpected places and calls you to unexpected paths. He'd been terrified to tell me, unsure if I felt the same way, worried that our friendship might be ruined if I didn't. But watching me stress about Daniel's wedding, listening to me describe Patricia's cruelty, he'd realized life was too short to stay silent about love. I stood there on the Charleston sidewalk, tourists streaming past, the church bells from St. Philip's ringing in the distance, and I realized I was crying. But they were happy tears, overwhelmed tears, tears of relief and joy and disbelief at this impossible turn of events. I told Thomas I'd been falling for him too, had been telling myself it was impossible, that he was a priest, that I needed to protect our friendship by never acknowledging these feelings. And now here he was, free to love me, choosing to love me, making this grand gesture in front of my ex and his horrible mother and all of Charleston society. We didn't go to the reception at Kiowa Island. Instead, Thomas and I drove to Folly Beach, found a quiet spot on the sand and talked for hours about everything. About his decision to leave priesthood and what it meant for his future. About my feelings for him and my fears about another relationship after Daniel. About what we both wanted from life and whether those visions were compatible. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, when Thomas officially asked me to date him, to give this relationship a real chance, to see if what we had could grow into something lasting. I said yes, feeling more certain about this decision than I'd felt about anything in years. The aftermath of that wedding was spectacular, in the most Charleston way possible. The story spread through the historic district like wildfire. Patricia Carter was mortified, claiming we'd deliberately ruined her son's wedding, demanding apologies from the Episcopal Church for allowing such a spectacle. Daniel was reportedly furious, though I suspected his anger was more about being upstaged than any real concern for my well-being. Mackenzie, from what I heard, was actually more amused than upset, apparently having a better sense of humor about the whole thing than her new husband or mother-in-law. My friends thought it was the most romantic thing they'd ever witnessed. The Historic Society board members who'd been at the wedding couldn't stop talking about it at our next meeting, several of them congratulating me and saying Patricia Carter had needed to be taken down a peg for years. Even the local newspaper's society columnist mentioned it obliquely in her next column, talking about unexpected disruptions at a recent society wedding and noting that sometimes love finds us in the most surprising circumstances. Thomas and I dated for a year. A real courtship where we navigated his transition from priesthood to civilian life, where we introduced each other to our families, where we built a relationship based on friendship and shared values and genuine compatibility. My parents adored him, appreciating his kindness and his intelligence and the way he clearly cherished me. His parents, retired teachers living in Columbia, welcomed me warmly into their family, never making me feel like I had to be anyone other than myself. He found work as a chaplain at a hospice center, continuing his calling to serve others in a meaningful way while no longer bound by priestly vows. I continued my work with the Historic Society, and Thomas would often join me at preservation events, genuinely interested in the architecture and history. We were partners in the truest sense, supporting each other's work, sharing household responsibilities, building a life that felt authentic and joyful. We got married on a spring day in Charleston at one of the historic homes I'd helped restore. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends, held in a garden courtyard with azaleas in full bloom and Spanish moss hanging from ancient live oaks. No society expectations, no pressure to invite people we didn't actually care about, just a celebration of commitment surrounded by people who genuinely loved us. My dad walked me down the makeshift aisle we'd created through the garden, and when I reached Thomas, he had tears in his eyes. Our vows were simple but heartfelt. Promises to support each other's callings, to choose each other daily, to build a life of meaning and service together. One of Thomas's priest friends from his seminary days, who'd been granted permission to perform marriages, officiated the ceremony. In his homily, he talked about unexpected paths and the courage it takes to follow love even when it leads somewhere you never anticipated. At the reception, my best friend gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying. She talked about how she'd watched me go through heartbreak and emerge stronger, how she'd seen me slowly fall for Thomas while thinking it was impossible, how she'd never seen me happier than I was right now. She joked about the dramatic exit from Daniel's wedding, saying it was the most Charleston thing that had ever happened, combining religious drama, social scandal, and romantic gesture all in one perfect moment. We honeymooned in Italy, exploring ancient churches and historic architecture, eating incredible food and walking hand in hand through centuries-old cities. It was perfect not because everything went smoothly, we had delayed flights and got lost more than once and dealt with a hotel mix-up, but because we were together, because we could laugh at the mishaps and marvel at the beauty and just enjoy being present with each other. Coming back to Charleston, settling into married life in our renovated carriage house that was now truly our home, felt like coming home to a life I'd never imagined but had always been meant for. Thomas's presence made everything better. Morning coffee on our small patio, discussing our days over dinner, working side by side on weekend projects, attending historic preservation events and hospice fundraisers together. We were building something real and lasting, based on who we actually were rather than who anyone else thought we should be. I ran into Patricia Carter about 6 months after our wedding. It was at a historic preservation fundraiser, one of those events where Charleston's various social worlds collide. I saw her across the room and debated whether to avoid her or confront her. Before I could decide, she approached me, her expression unreadable. She stood there for a moment and I braced myself for another cruel comment, another dismissal of my worthiness. But instead she said something I never expected. She said she owed me an apology. She said she'd been wrong about me, wrong to judge me based on social class and family connections, Wrong to make me feel less than. She said watching me at Daniel's wedding, seeing the man who'd left priesthood for me make that public declaration, had forced her to examine her own values and priorities. She said Daniel's marriage was struggling, that he and Mackenzie were already in counseling, that marrying someone based on social compatibility rather than genuine connection had proven to be as hollow as I'd probably suspected it would be. She said she'd realized too late that she'd pushed her son toward the wrong kind of life, prioritizing appearance over substance, status over happiness. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to gloat, to tell her I'd been right all along, that her cruel prediction about me never finding happiness had been spectacularly wrong. But looking at her, I saw something I'd never seen before. Regret. Genuine recognition of her mistakes. It didn't erase the hurt she'd caused, but it was something. I told her I appreciated the apology, that it meant more than she probably realized. I told her I hoped Daniel found his way to happiness, that despite everything I didn't wish him ill. And then I excused myself, returning to Thomas's side, returning to the life we'd built, leaving Patricia and her regrets behind. My name is Rebecca and I'm 32 years old. I went to my ex-fiancé's wedding where his mother whispered that I'd never be happy, and then I watched as the man I loved, a priest who was leaving his vocation for me, publicly declared his love in front of everyone who'd ever doubted my worth. And I learned that happiness isn't something you're allocated based on social class or family connections. It's something you build through authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the courage to choose love even when it comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing. Sometimes karma arrives not as punishment but as vindication. And sometimes the person who broke your heart does you the greatest favor of your life by setting you free to find someone who actually deserves you, who sees your value, who chooses you not despite who you are but because of it. That's the story of how I found real happiness, how I discovered that being rejected by the wrong person creates space for being chosen by the right one, how a painful ending became the beginning of something better than I ever could have imagined. And every time I think about Patricia's shocked face in that church, about Daniel's horror at being upstaged at his own wedding, about Thomas's courage in declaring his love so publicly, I smile. Because some moments are worth every bit of drama, every bit of scandal, every whispered conversation in Charleston's historic district. I'm happy. Genuinely, completely, authentically happy. And no amount of social disapproval or old money snobbery can take that away from me.